Get to the church blind! Get to the church blind! Go! Now!
I'm Pete Mitchell, and he's Peyton Jones, and you're listening to Hardcore Church Planning, the companion podcast to the Church Planner Podcast and Church Planner Magazine. Each week, we'll bring you interviews from planners who are in the trenches making it happen right now. These active church planners bear it all, share their successes, their failures, and what they'd wish they'd known when they were first starting out. Listen in to discover how God is working in their church plant.
You know, when I have a large project at home, sometimes it makes sense to do it by myself. At other times, I actually save money in the long term and have a much better solution if I use an expert. It's really not that much different with church planning. Church planners who focus on building their core team and actually planting the church and partner with portability experts like Portable Church Industries hit the ground running. Yes, you may have to raise more funds up front, but let me tell you something. If I could go back in a time machine and do one thing different in all the churches that I planted, I would go back and have invested that money in Portable Church and all of the super cool kit that they give you to make the volunteers and their lives much, much easier. Trust me, your volunteers will feel invested in, and they're going to give you more of what they got. And that time where people are setting up is going to be a time where it sets the atmosphere for you to thrive. If you're thinking about launching in the next 6 to 36 months, we encourage you to check them out at portablechurch.com. Hey, church planner, welcome to another edition of Hardcore Church Planning. I have here today with me my guest, Christopher James. He is the assistant professor of evangelism and missional Christianity at the University of Dubuque Theological Seminary. That was a mouthful, but you know what? That's a super cool title, man. Like, let me say that again. Assistant professor of evangelism and missional Christianity. You know, I'm Nacho Libre's going through my head. You know, I think I would like that kind of respect. That's pretty cool. You're like a luchador of mission. That's cool.
Well, thank you. I've never been given that title before.
You've never been on the show, but do you wear the stretchy pants, the missional stretchy pants? Because, Chancho, sometimes a man must wear the missional stretchy pants.
Only in certain settings.
We're going to get along really well. Well, hey, you have written a book. It is an awesome pleasure for me to introduce a book when someone's put a lot of thought. And of course, you know, here you are, you're a professor. You have written a robust, really text on church planning. And it was the title that caught me. It's Church Planning in Post-Christian Soil, Theology and Practice. Rad title. I've had a chance to dip into the book and look at it. It's meaty. I mean, it is, you know, it is academic. It is meaty. Yeah. You have done a lot of homework on this book. Let me ask you, why did you write this book? What drove you to write it?
Well, really, I mean, the bottom line for me is I wanted to see the church faithfully doing witness in our culture. And, you know, I did it the way that I did it for 4 reasons. I thought about this in advance because, right, I'm a professor. I think about how am I going to answer a question like this? So the first reason is that I did it this way, which is, as you said, robust. A lot of research went into it because I have a feeling that, in a sense, from reading a lot of the literature that's out there, that there's a lot of church planning literature that's really more based on anecdotes and sort of proof texts than there are books that are really digging in deep, doing serious and well-calibrated sociological and theological research. So I felt like, hey, this is something I can contribute, and that was the first reason. The second reason I did it the way that I did it, and this isn't in the title, but on the cover, maybe you noticed this from the beginning. It's got the Space Needle, right, reflected in a glass ball from the Chihuly Garden right next to the Space Needle. And the study is focused in Seattle, Washington. which, as many people will probably know, one of the most unchurched cities in the country. Mark Driscoll sort of famously wrote, "Welcome to the United States of Seattle," because it's not just a post-Christian place, but it's a place sort of on the leading edges of a lot of our cultural changes toward urbanization, toward progressive cultural values, toward technology. And back in 2001, it was dubbed the None Zone. This is where so many folks are not affiliated with religion. So I said, I got to do a thorough research project. I got to do it somewhere where it's going to be significant and sort of have significance beyond its own location. So I studied Seattle because I thought it had something to say more broadly about the American context. I also did it the way that I did it, which we'll get into later. The way that I did it was fully ecumenical, meaning not just a certain type of church, but really all the churches happening in Seattle that had been planted. And I did it that way because I really, my own journey has been through a lot of different kinds of churches. And as much as there are those churches that I would say, yeah, they're off the tracks, they're in theological error here or there. I have a deep conviction that when God looks at the church, God sees the whole church, not just the churches that I feel at home in. So I did it as a study of all the churches across the denominations. Every church that would sort of the bottom line is they baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That means they recognize the core teaching of Jesus is the Son of God. God is known as a Trinity. So anyway, that's maybe a longer answer than you're looking for, but my heart really is to see the church adapt and engage its changing culture in a way that's faithful, and to learn from a place like Seattle that has a lot to tell the rest of the nation about where it's headed. So,
that just having that heart right there, man, that's worth the price of admission. When you talk about, I think there needs to be a broadness in church planting if we're going to learn, my tribe or your tribe or whatever tribe we identify with, we all have our blind spots.
Yeah.
And so I agree with you, man. I think that, the more we can kind of cross these denominational network barriers and work together as a body of Christ, all the better. Yeah. I mean, I certainly don't have everything figured out yet. And I say yet because when I get to heaven, I'll be the boss. You need to talk to me in eternity because I show you. I'd be like, okay, come here, I'll tell you.
We'll all know perfectly as we're perfectly known, as the scripture says.
No, just me.
Yeah, just you. You're still going to be the expert, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. But no, and I think until that day, man, like you said, we know in part. And I love that your book, like for me, that is just, I train church planners for North American Mission Board. And we always talk about maintaining the posture of a learner throughout your existence as a trainer. And being that you're an educator, I know that you're like, hey, I barely scratch. I mean, it's a meaty book. It's weighty, but I know you probably feel like you just scratched the surface. Talk to me a little bit about church planning for grandpa, back in the 80s, 90s. Versus church planning today in post-Christian soil?
Interesting question. So, I mean, back in the day, we would call this Christendom, the day when there was social cachet in being a church member, where basically everybody went to church, and even if they didn't go to church, they said they went to church because it gave you some like credence in the wider culture. So. Back in the day, really all you had to do was find a suburb that was growing, get together a good preacher and a good band, and put out your like Baptist church, First Baptist Church, or whatever your tribe is. Put out your denominational label, and if you build it, they will come. Right? That's sort of the classic strategy. And a lot of churches, in various denominations, really were planted in the 70s because this was sort of a heyday of denominational church planting. So that's the background. I mean, today we just simply don't have that culture anymore where going to church earns you points with your friends. To the contrary, going to church in a lot of places, and especially in urban areas, is sort of like you're going to get a weird look, right? So you can't bank on the denominational cachet. You can't bank on it being normal to join a church. So you really have to think like a missionary. And this is really a major transition that happened for the church in the West, North America, and Europe. In the last century, was waking up to the fact that it's not just mission fields in Africa and Asia and South America, but in fact, as Leslie Newbegin said, one of my favorite people to read, North America and the West is actually one of the most difficult mission fields in the world. And so church planting in North American context today has to be missionary work, which means analyzing your environment, your neighborhood, your context deeply, using all the disciplines you can. So use sociology, use culture studies, use whatever you can to sort of unpack what's going on in the hearts of people in this environment. Where are people opening up to real community? What are the longings and what are the aspirations of people in this context? So all that missionary work is really what church planting takes in our context. And so, the churches that I found in Seattle that were making it, they had done some of this work. And part of that meant in the urban setting of Seattle, they were paying attention to what's going on in the urban environment. And a big piece of that, as probably many of your listeners will know, is sort of the rise of localism, the rise of neighborhood identity. So in Seattle, I found people, if I ask them where they're from, they wouldn't say they're from Seattle. They say they're from Greenwood. They say they're from Capitol Hill. If they say they just moved to the neighborhood, they might just mean they moved from one neighborhood over to the next. So this really cultural phenomenon of a longing for a more local urban life. That's one thing that many of the churches I found were tapping into and saying, you know what, there's something beautiful about that. And we can approach church planting in a way that's not just a church for the city, but is actually a church for the neighborhood. And in my book, if folks are willing to dive in, they'll see that some of the theological work I draw on from the last 200 years of missionary reflection really suggests that kind of move toward the local identity and local mission is really, in some ways, better theologically than a lot of the more strategy-focused approaches that are kind of how big can we go, how big can be our circle of influence. So, yeah, it's a new world out there, and that's certainly why I wanted to write this book. Is there's a growing awareness across the board that we can't do church planting how we did in the 70s anymore.
Right. So what would you say to someone planting today? So if you were talking to a church planter, you're saying, look, you're planting in post-Christian soil. What are the things that you think that a church planter needs to make sure that they don't miss planting in this environment?
Okay, good question. Well, I guess a place I would probably start is to get them to think about their own, what they're bringing to the task of church planting. When I talk to church planters, my students who are preparing to plant, I ask them a question. I ask them, what's a church experience that burned you and you're running away from in your own church plant? Maybe you grew up you had some negative experience that you hope your church plant will not replicate. And what's some positive experience you had that you hope your church plant will replicate? So, people need to know what they're bringing to the process. They need to know what they're aspiring for, what they see, what they think the church looks like when it's really being the church. That's a place to start. And in my book, I unpack 4 primary models, the 4 sort of major ways that churches are taking shape, and each of them have advantages and disadvantages, both theological and practical in terms of planning in a place like Seattle. So, doing that reflection on what am I bringing, what am I hoping for, what am I expecting, would lead them in the direction of reflecting on what are the potential pitfalls of what I'm shooting for, and what are the potential advantages of it. On another level, I mentioned already, you really need to address and get beyond the immediate skepticism that people are going to have about your agenda. And as a church planter, they assume your agenda is to grow your church. And so first of all, check yourself. Is your agenda to grow a church? I hope your agenda is to partner with God and to love your neighbor, because that's really that's something that can be winsome. And and sometimes there can be a conflict, internal conflict and an external conflict over, am I really doing this out of love for God and neighbor? Am I doing this out of building a little kingdom for myself? So that's an important check. And post-Christian people can read it a mile away. If you're motivated by sort of this little kingdom thing. There's a few other things from the book, but I don't know what you want to drill into as far as major tips, I guess, that I would give for folks planning in church in a post-Christian context. You want me to go there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So I think I've got 3 here. Number 1, think about the rhythms of your church, the things that are kind of the day-to-day or week-to-week life of the church. Instead of having the old grandpa mentality of we just put on a worship service and then that's it, we're just basically all around everybody attracting people to worship. Reflect on what a monthly rhythm will look like in your church. So as I surveyed I studied 105 churches planted in Seattle, inside the city limits, and one of the themes that ran through was the churches that were taking root were paying attention to the ways that the rhythms, the practices, the habits of their church had 2 functions. First, the way you do church tells the people who come what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And it also tells the people in your wider community what you think it means to follow Jesus. So if the way you do church is we have a worship service, the end, then people in the church and outside the church will think that really following Jesus is just about going to a Sunday event or maybe some other day of the week. But some of the churches that were most inspiring to me were those that were planting with a missional community model where they had a monthly rhythm. Like one talked about this rhythm of study, serve, study, play. Others had rhythms of hospitality. Once a month, the missional community, the small group gets together to serve. Once a month, they get together to throw a party for their neighbors. When you put these habits into the life of a church plant, it's not just like a good thing to do. It actually is forming people in what it means to follow Jesus. Serving is not extra credit. Hospitality is not like extra credit that you tell people to do in the end of the sermon. Like, go do that this week. You've got to build them into the life of the church as a normal thing that the majority of people are doing on a regular basis. So that's number 1, is craft the whole life of the church, not just a kick-ass worship service.
Yeah. So I really like that. So you talked about, you got the worship service. Can you just dig into that a little bit more and tell me, because you mentioned like some of them really inspired you. So everybody thinks, Sunday, and then they think something like maybe home group, or if they're talking missional community, or like you said, once a month barbecue. What are some things that guys were doing that kind of, as you said, it preached a message? This is Christianity. What was some of that good stuff?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the most obvious one, I've already mentioned it, is the making service, and particularly local service, a rhythm of the life of every disciple of Christ in your church. And you don't do that by having, in my opinion, a big church initiative. You have, and I saw this in many of these missional communities, each missional community, through their leadership, would pick sort of a local cause. And they would say, once a month or more, we're going to be invested in this. And this is a way to build credibility. It's also a way to build that habit of service is what it means to follow Jesus in a certain way. And it opens up relationships with folks. I even recommend don't serve at the Christian food pantry. Serve with non-Christians. Get out there and rub shoulders with people and do it out of love that comes from God. So that's one of them, is service. I also mentioned hospitality, and this is one that I think is sometimes overlooked. But there's a church out there called Lux Community, Lux, focused on light. And one of their missional communities had started a margarita night. Okay, they had said, how are we going to get into relationships with the folks who work at, I don't know if it was Chili's or something, one of these local places that was located in their neighborhood. And so they said, hey, let's just invite people to sort of fellowship. So creating spaces where you aren't in control. It's not a Bible study, but it is doing exactly what Jesus does all throughout the Gospels, having food with the wrong people, sharing drinks and meals and rubbing shoulders and expressing love. That's like what it means to follow Jesus, I think, is to copy and echo that ministry of Jesus. Another really interesting one, a church called Community Dinners. This was a 90-year-old Pentecostal church that had been doing the worship-centered church somewhat successfully, for decades. And they said, you know what? We think part of what it means to follow Jesus is actually that you are in real relationship with the poor. And so that's not going to be an extra credit activity for our church anymore. That's going to be ingrained in the rhythms of our church. So what they did is they basically shut the whole Sunday morning thing down, and they now exist as community dinners, 5 nights a week in 5 different urban villages of Seattle. And these meals, as the pastor Verlin Fosner has described to me, three different kinds of people make up the 3 major groups. One are the people who really need a good meal. So you got the poor, you got the homeless, you got the low income folks, you've got the good neighbors, the folks who are like, it's a beautiful thing that you're putting on a meal, and then you've got the missionaries or the church, the people who are following Jesus already. And so they've made it their rhythm of church that every time they gather to hear the gospel, to share fellowship with each other, to pray, they do it in the company of the poor because they believe that's what it means to follow Jesus. So, I mean, there's radical ways you can think outside the box, but in some ways, you start with asking the question, what does it mean to follow Jesus, and how would we build that into the rhythms of our church? Not just in the service, but in everything that we're doing.
So that right there, just at the rhythms of the church preach, what it means to follow Jesus, and is itself as a sermon. That's just huge. I mean, I looking at my own church planning experience, I relate to the last story you told about the church that meets with the poor. Like we would, people would come and say, because our service we would eat. There was a communal meal at every Sunday, and people would say, well, so you feed the poor here, and we're like, no. We eat together as a community. Like, these are my neighbors. These are the people I worship with. Like, we're eating just even changing that language, that following Jesus means that language no longer has any meaning, that reminds me of something really important that I do want to express to your listeners. And that is some of the churches that, were the best at these missional communities. One of their weaknesses was in the way they described their context. And this goes way back to early missionary work, right? Where missionaries sort of painted the picture of Africa as this pagan wasteland where there's nothing good happening, and we have to be, bring light there. And sometimes a similar sort of portrait happens in church plants these days, where they're trying to motivate giving, they're trying to motivate people to join the team. And so they kind of paint a real dark picture. There's so many non-Christians here, and it's just a battleground. And while it's true on the one hand, on the other hand, God is there before we show up. God is doing things in the midst of that environment. And so learning to celebrate and praise and give glory to God for the things that are already beautiful that are happening in your city, in your community, that I think it really gets to the heart of some of the things that sometimes go wrong in one of the 4 models that probably is most common among many of your listeners. And so when I give recommendations in the end of the book to church planters in what I call the Great Commission Team model, I say, get out there and serve, but don't be in charge when you're serving. Serve as a servant. And number 2, throw parties, but not just parties where how should I change this? Get out there and enjoy what's beautiful about your place. So if it's go enjoy a craft beer or go to the opera or whatever it is, find things that you can celebrate and say, this is beautiful about this place to which we've been sent. That I think that can be a helpful corrective for this sort of disproportionate relationship that is reflected in what you said before. We serve the poor, or we're witnessing to the non-Christians. Yes,
and we're also testifying to the work of God that's already happening in the lives of.
That's so important, man. I love the fact that what you're saying, because here's the deal, right? Like there's that joke that the church planting starts with kind of almost like a spitting match to see, who can have the biggest crap hole on the planet. My city, you've all seen it, right? My city's the biggest crap hole on the planet, and that's why I'm going there. Rather than, like you said, I love how Jesus, right? When he comes on the scene, he goes to the disciples now. You are going to reap where others have sown. Who in the heck is Jesus talking about, right? Like, go on. I know you're excited.
Oh, no, you're exactly right. Because God was there before you got there. God's been planting seeds, and before we get there, and God's going to keep doing the work, after we're dead and gone. So really that posture, and this comes from, again, the last 250 years of mission work. Missionaries realized, we had this idea that we were going to show up to a blank slate that was just all darkness, and realized that God had been at work before we got there. So the work of a church planter, of a missionary, is to have a ability to name the brokenness and the beauty of your context, to be able to say, look, God has been at work here, like Paul does in the Areopagus. He says, look, I've been walking around your town. You got a lot of idols I can tell you are very religious. And there's something, he starts off on that positive note. And he's also able in Acts 17 to draw in, you've got some poets and philosophers, they got something good to say, but let me tell you more about that. In him we live and move and have our being. Yeah, let me tell you what that really means. So being able to again, speak in a balanced way about the brokenness and the beauty. It's one of those fine lines that many churches fall off on one side where they have nothing critical to say, and churches fall off on the other side where they can't seem to find anything positive to say.
What a great balance. That's really good, man. So I know we're approaching the end of our time, but the book is called Church Planting in Post-Christian Soil by Christopher James. It's published by Oxford University Press. So you're going to be getting a lot of cool studies in here. Like he said, it centers really around the work of Seattle, which there's a lot. The Pacific Northwest is a pretty daunting place to plant in. I recently trained a bunch of guys all from Oregon, and of course Portland is the place church planters go to die, right? I mean, it's good night, sayonara. And yet I've got a church planter up there who's planted, and he's doing a CrossFit gym. We had him on here, Anton Firo with PDX Church, and it's going well, but it's outside of the box. Church planting in post-Christian soil, there is a different approach, and lo and behold, I'm sure you would agree, Christopher James, that we basically, when we do that, we actually experience more of what the New Testament was talking about. We kind of rediscover stuff that's been forgotten.
Yeah, because that's very much like the experience of the early church. They didn't have cultural capital really to offer beyond the gospel. And so really just taking shape as a church that's a blessing to your community and faithful to the gospel you can't count on people coming to church because people go to church just as a habit. Yeah.
Excellent.
I want to say one other thing, Peyton, because I know we are short on time, but you mentioned that it's a scholarly study. But I don't want your readers to be scared away. I'm actually, or your listeners to be scared off, because I'm in the process right now of creating a official church planter's guide to the book that will hopefully help folks like your listeners navigate through the book in a way that's most useful to church planters themselves. That hopefully, helps create some questions for reflection maybe on your team, directs you to find which chapters are going to be most relevant to your particular approach and your particular context. So I want folks to know that I'm working on resources to make it really accessible.
That's fantastic, man. And what a big help. The reality is that really to understand even, the makeup, like how to assess your city, all that kind of stuff, it's all in here, and it's helpful, man. So I appreciate you putting together a guide as well. We've got all kinds of listeners here. We got As I said to you before, we've got guys that have their PhDs that listen. And then we've got guys where, as I said before, God's gifted them in other areas.
Yeah.
And maybe not academia, but, I always challenge our guys to read, to read from everyone and to be omnivorous in their learning. Listen to your PhDs, listen to your guys on the ground who, haven't read a book in 10 years, but, Holy Spirit's using them the same. You got your Moody's and your Lloyd Joneses, and that's fantastic. So, grab the book. It's Church Planting in Post-Christian Soil, Theology and Practice. And one last question we like to always kind of, ask when we're doing this. Our guests never see it coming, but our question today is if you and by the way, this changes every time, but if you and JD Payne were to get in a physical fist fight, who would win?
I would win.
Yes.
And let me tell you why. I was a wrestler. I was a pretty good wrestler. And the thing about a fist fight is it always turns into a wrestling match.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. You exchange a couple punches, but then you're down on the mat and I'm going to be on top. So
absolutely. Yeah, you're right. See, you've been in a few scraps. See, you're a bit more street with a title like this. He's got some good titles. I got to say, he's got Apostolic Church Plant. It's a good title. I wish I had written that book. But Church Planting in Post-Christian Soil is a contender. Like that's right up there on book titles. So, and I love that you can throw down and be like, "Hey, it's a post-Christian world, man. I'm gonna kill you. This is great. But then afterwards, I'm gonna talk about peace and love because we should just get along. That's what you'll do after, right?
I might be saying peace all the way through. Yeah, I'm more into the arts of redirection.
Yes. I really hate to do this to you, JD, but I'm a professor too, and you need some schooling. You see, I'm going to do the smack talk for you. I
would love to sit down with him. Maybe not a fist fight, but I'd enjoy the conversation.
Yeah, just don't have me in the room because I'll be laughing the whole time remembering this conversation. And JD, by the way, has been a guest on the show. I know we've made him throw down with people. So it's all fair play. It's an equal opportunity. We do this to all of our guests every time. I don't know why. It just started once and it continued. So, from the first show, as a matter of fact. So anyways, Hey, my guest has been Christopher B. James. Check him out. Christopher, where can people catch up with you outside of buying the book? Do you got a blog or webpage?
Website, chrisbjames.com. I'm also on Twitter. Chris B. James is the handle. So those are probably the easiest ones. From my website, you can get links to everything else, everywhere else I am, Facebook and all that. But that's the main place. And if any of your listeners happen to be out in Dane County near Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin, that's my location for my next research. So if you're there, look me up, shoot me an email or tweet me because I'd love to connect. I'm working on what mission looks like in Dane County, grappling with the differences between a progressive city and a pretty conservative rural parts of the county there. So I'd love to connect with those folks in particular.
Very cool. All right. Well, guys, you might be in his next book. So check it out, guys. And this has been Hardcore Church Planting, and you've been listening to Peyton Jones and Christopher B. James. Arnold, sign us out.
Remember, if you are called to church planting, go hardcore or go home.
You've been listening to Hardcore Church Planting. Hardcore Church Planting has been brought to you by the Church Planter Podcast and the Church Planter Magazine, which is available in the App Store for both Apple and Android devices. If you like this episode, leave us a positive review. If you didn't like this episode, we'll be happy to give you your money back.